The night I realized we had nowhere to sleep, it was raining. Not the soft kind of rain that smells like earth and feels like mercy. It was the kind of rain that comes sideways. The kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and runs cold fingers down your spine. I was standing on the sidewalk outside what used to be our apartment building, holding 2 garbage bags stuffed with everything I had managed to grab in 40 minutes, and my daughter Lily was pressed against my left side. And my son Caleb was holding my right hand so tightly that my fingers had gone numb 20 minutes earlier and I hadn't said a word about it. Lily was 9, Caleb was 5 years old, and he was staring up at the building with this look on his face that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not crying, not asking questions, just watching the lit windows of the floors above us like he was memorizing something. Like some part of him already understood that we were not going back inside tonight. Maybe not ever. I am Rachel, and this is the story of the night I lost everything, and the 2 years that followed, and the strange and terrifying and ultimately miraculous path that led me somewhere I never in my life expected to stand. I need you to stay with me, because what happened 2 years after that night on the sidewalk is something I still don't fully have words for, something I couldn't have invented if I tried. And I need you to understand where I was standing before you can understand what it meant to arrive at the other side. So let me take you back, not just to that night, but to the months before it. The quiet erosion that I kept telling myself wasn't happening. The cracks I kept painting over because I was too afraid to look at what was underneath. My name is Rachel Mercer, and 18 months before, I stood in the rain with 2 garbage bags and 2 children and nowhere to go. I thought I was building something solid. I thought I was doing everything right. I'd been working as an office manager for a small logistics company in Columbus, Ohio for 6 years. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the kind of career I had imagined for myself when I was 22 with a community college degree and a head full of optimism. But it was steady, it paid, it had health insurance, which when you are a single mother means more than almost anything else in the world. I had learned that lesson the hard way when Caleb was born with a minor respiratory issue that required 2 specialist visits in his first year. And I watched the bills arrive with a kind of cold disbelief that I think permanently rewired something in my brain about financial safety. So I held on to that job, the way you hold on to a railing on an icy morning. Both hands, eyes forward, careful steps. And for a while, it worked. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Westmont Avenue. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen window that faced east so the morning light came in gold and warm across the linoleum. I had hung curtains that Lily chose herself, a pale yellow fabric with small white flowers, and she was so proud of them that she used to arrange her stuffed animals on the windowsill every morning so they could, as she said, enjoy the view. Caleb had a dinosaur comforter that he refused to sleep without, and a habit of narrating his own life as he moved through it. A quiet running commentary that would follow me down the hallway while I made lunches. Mom is making sandwiches again. Mom is cutting the crusts. Good. The crusts are very bad. He made me laugh every single day of his life. That boy. And I told myself that was enough. That the laughter and the curtains and the gold morning light and the 2 little people who needed me were enough to hold everything together. I told myself that the slow drain in my savings account was temporary. I told myself that the way my boss Marcus had been looking at me differently for the past 3 months was just stress on his end. Nothing to do with me. I told myself that the economy would shift, things would improve, the expenses would level out, and I would catch up. I was very good at telling myself things. But here is what I did not tell myself. What I refused to see clearly, even when the evidence was stacking up like unpaid notices on my kitchen counter. The company was struggling, had been struggling for almost a year. Marcus was not stressed. Marcus was terrified. And somewhere in the fiscal calculations of a business I had given 6 years of my life to, my position had been quietly moved from necessary to expendable. The day he called me into his office and said the words I had been convincing myself would never come, I remember thinking about Lily's curtains. I don't know why. Marcus was talking about restructuring, about a difficult decision, about how much he valued my contribution, and my mind kept pulling toward those pale yellow curtains and the way the morning light made them look almost luminous. I walked out of that building with a cardboard box of desk items and 3 weeks of severance and a smile on my face that didn't crack until I was in the parking garage and the door to the stairwell closed behind me. and then I sat down on the concrete steps and pressed my back against the wall and breathed through my nose for a very long time before I was capable of driving home. What I had in savings would cover 2 months of rent, maybe 2.5 if I was very careful. The severance would stretch it another 3 weeks. I went home and made a spreadsheet that evening after the kids were asleep. And I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water I kept forgetting to drink. And I looked at the numbers until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a clock. I count them. 40 minutes left, 30:20. And the alarm at the end was not a gentle chime. I knew that already. I applied for jobs the next morning. I applied for 73 jobs over the next 6 weeks. I heard back from 11. I interviewed with 4. I was offered nothing. The job market in Columbus that winter was not kind to mid-level office managers with community college credentials and a 6-year gap and variety of experience. I was competing against people with bachelor's degrees and LinkedIn profiles with endorsements from industry professionals and interview suits that had not been dry cleaned into fading. I updated my resume 4 times. I bought a blazer from a consignment shop and wore it to every interview with the same pair of black pants because they were the only ones that still fit correctly after my most recent bout of stress eating, which I was also not admitting to myself at the time. But here is the thing about job searching that nobody warns you about when you are desperate. Desperation has a smell. Not literally, but interviewers are humans, and humans are perceptive in ways that bypass logic. And something in the air around a person who needs this job too badly shifts the chemistry of a room. I could feel it happening. I could feel myself trying too hard, leaning in too far, laughing slightly too quickly at things that weren't quite funny enough. I was performing competence so hard that I was undermining the actual competence that was genuinely there. 43 days after losing my job, I missed rent for the first time in my adult life. My landlord, a man named Gerald, who had always been perfectly pleasant when I passed him in the lobby, left a note under my door that was courteous and firm in equal measure. He had a business to run. He was sorry for my situation. He hoped I would be able to bring the account current within 30 days. I told him I would. I meant it with every cell in my body. I called my sister Dana in Indianapolis. Dana is 4 years older than me and has a husband who works in insurance and a house in the suburbs with a finished basement and a trampoline in the backyard. I had not asked Dana for money since I was 26 and between apartments and broke in the specific way. You are broke when you are young enough that it still feels like an adventure. Dana was generous. Dana wired me $600 and told me to take care of myself and call her if I needed anything. In the voice people use when they are offering help but also hoping you won't need to call again. I spent $600 on groceries, a portion of the utilities, and Caleb's asthma inhaler refill, which even with the discount pharmacy coupon cost me $84 for a medication that costs $3 to manufacture. But that is a different kind of rage for a different kind of story. The 60 days became 70, the 70 became 90. Gerald stopped leaving courteous notes and started leaving official documents. I started answering my phone only when I recognized the number, which meant I stopped answering my phone almost entirely. Because collections departments are very persistent and very good at acquiring numbers you did not give them. It was during this period, the quiet, suffocating period where I was still maintaining the appearance of normalcy for my children while quietly being devoured from the inside, that I made the mistake that still, even now, makes me press my hand flat against my sternum when I think about it. The mistake that accelerated everything, the one that I knew, even as I was making it, had a particular quality of wrongness that my gut was screaming about and my exhausted, desperate brain was screaming louder to ignore. His name was Derek. I had known Derek peripherally through a friend of a friend for about 2 years. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming when they want something from you, which is to say he was very attentive and very warm and very willing to tell you exactly what you needed to hear at the precise moment you needed most to hear it. He ran what he described as a property management consulting business, which in practice meant he helped people navigate rental agreements and sometimes connected landlords with tenants and sometimes brokered short-term sublet arrangements. He told me he could help. He said he had a contact who needed a reliable tenant for a 2-bedroom in a better part of the city, below market rate, in exchange for some basic property upkeep. He said he could front the first and last month's deposit as a loan, that I could pay him back over 12 months once I was working again. He said he had helped 6 families in situations like mine, and he showed me testimonials on a website that looked professional enough that I didn't look harder at it. I gave him $800. Every dollar I had left in my personal savings, which I had been protecting like a last ember. He called it a processing fee. He said it was standard. He said the lease paperwork would be ready in 4 days. He disappeared within 48 hours. The website was gone. His phone went straight to voicemail and then stopped accepting messages. The friend of a friend who had introduced us had not seen him in months. I filed a report with the police, and the officer who took my information was patient and kind, and told me honestly that these cases were very difficult to prosecute and that I was almost certainly not going to recover that money. I sat in my car outside the police station for a long time after that. I did not cry. I was past crying by then. There is a place beyond crying that you reach when the losses accumulate past a certain threshold. When your nervous system has been running on emergency power for so long that even grief starts to feel like a luxury you cannot afford. I sat in the car and I breathed and I thought about Lily's curtains and Caleb's dinosaur comforter, and I thought, okay, what is the next step? What is the very next step? But I had no next step. For the first time in my life, the path had simply ended. There was no road ahead. There was no plan B. There was Gerald's final notice sitting on my kitchen counter, next to an empty fruit bowl and a permission slip for Lily's field trip that I had not been able to pay for. And the date on Gerald's notice was 4 days away, and I had $22 in my checking account and a tank of gas that was down to a quarter. I told the kids on a Tuesday. I sat them both on the couch, and I said it as plainly and as calmly as I could. I said we were going to have to move out of our apartment for a while, that this was something that happened sometimes, but it did not mean anything bad about us or about our family, that Mom was working on finding us somewhere new to stay. Lily looked at me for a very long time with those dark, serious eyes of hers. The eyes that have always seemed to belong to someone older, someone who has been watching the world carefully since the beginning. And then she said, "Are we going to be homeless, Mom?" I did not say yes. I said we were between places. I said it with a steadiness that cost me more than I can describe. Caleb said, "Can we bring the dinosaur blanket?" "Yes, baby. We can absolutely bring the dinosaur blanket." On the day we left, I packed 2 garbage bags with the most essential things: clothing, medications, important documents, the dinosaur blanket, Lily's favorite book, my laptop which was 3 years old and had a cracked corner but still worked. I left the curtains. I don't know why. Maybe because taking them felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Or maybe because some part of me wanted to believe that someone else would put children in that room and look at those pale yellow flowers in the light and feel something good. Gerald was not there when we left. I was grateful for that. And that is how I came to be standing on the sidewalk on Westmont Avenue in the rain, 2 garbage bags at my feet, Lily pressed against my left side, Caleb's hand cutting off the circulation in my right fingers, staring at a building I could no longer enter. I had one destination in mind: the Pathway Family Shelter on the south side of Columbus, which I had looked up 3 days earlier in the specific way you look up things you are hoping you will not need. They had a family intake process. They required an appointment for full placement, but they had a walk-in night intake for emergency situations. This qualified as an emergency situation. This was, by any measurable definition, an emergency. I loaded the kids and the bags into my car, which was a 2014 Honda Civic with a passenger side mirror that had been cracked since the previous winter and a heating system that worked fine as long as you didn't need the fan above setting 2. We drove to the shelter in silence except for the rain and the wipers and Caleb's quiet voice from the back seat, which said, "Are shelters like hotels?" "A little bit like hotels," I said. "Different, but a little bit." "Do they have breakfast?" "I don't know yet, baby. We'll find out together." He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "That's an adventure." And I gripped the steering wheel with both hands and kept my eyes on the road and did not let myself fall apart. Because we were in traffic and I needed to see clearly, and also because I had decided somewhere in the previous 4 days that I was not going to fall apart in front of my children, that I was going to be whatever they needed me to be, that if they needed me to be calm, I would be calm. If they needed me to be hopeful, I would find some fragment of hope and hold it up to the light until it was the only thing in the room. But here is the thing I did not know yet, the thing that I could not have known standing in line at the shelter intake desk at 9, 45 on a Tuesday night with rain still drying in my hair and 2 children half asleep against my sides. The worst was not over. I thought the worst was over. I thought that reaching the shelter was a bottom, a floor, and that everything from here would be a slow climb upward. I was wrong. The Pave family shelter was clean and it was safe, and the woman at the intake desk had a calm professional warmth that I have thought about many times since. The way she looked at me without pity and without judgment, just a kind of steady acknowledgement. She processed our paperwork in under 20 minutes and took us to a room that had 3 cots and a lockbox for valuables and a window that faced the parking lot. There were 2 other families in adjacent rooms. I could hear a baby crying through the wall and the low murmur of a television somewhere down the hall. Lily lay down on her cot and stared at the ceiling without speaking. Caleb curled up under his dinosaur blanket and was asleep within 4 minutes, in the way that small children can simply choose sleep when the world is too complicated. I sat on the edge of my cot in the dark room with the orange glow of the parking lot lights coming through the window, and I looked at my children and I thought about every decision I had ever made and tried to trace the exact path that had led here. Tried to find the moment where I had gone wrong. The single turning point where a different choice might have put us somewhere else tonight. But it wasn't one moment. That is what I kept coming back to. It was never one moment. It was accumulation. It was the slow pressure of small things, each individually survivable, collectively catastrophic. It was the job market and the healthcare costs and the scam, and the savings that weren't quite enough, and the sister who helped once but couldn't help again, and the friends who didn't know the full picture because I had been too ashamed to show them. It was pride, among other things. It was pride. And that night, in the shelter, in the orange dark with my children sleeping around me, I made a quiet and private promise to myself to let go of that particular brand of pride. The kind that keeps you from asking, the kind that keeps you invisible when visibility might save you. I promised myself that I would stop trying to look like I was managing. I would stop performing okayness for an audience of people who weren't even watching that closely. It was a small promise. I didn't know yet what it would cost me to keep it. The shelter allowed families to stay for up to 60 days in the initial placement, with case management support and access to a resource coordinator who helped connect residents with employment services, benefits, applications, childcare assistance, and transitional housing programs. My case manager was a woman named Brenda, 40-something, practical. With reading glasses, she wore a beaded chain and a calendar on her desk that was covered in different colored sticky notes. Brenda had seen everything. Brenda had also kept her capacity for genuine attention, which I think is one of the rarest things a person can maintain in a job like hers. She sat across from me on my 3rd day and she asked me to tell her everything. Not just the facts, everything. And something about the way she said it, the weight she gave that word, made me actually do it. I told her about the job and the scam and the savings and the sister and the curtains I left behind. I told her about the field trip permission slip. I told her about Caleb's inhaler and the $84. I told her about the spreadsheet I had made at the kitchen table and the way the numbers had looked like a countdown. Brenda listened without interrupting for 11 minutes. I know this because there was a clock on the wall behind her head and I kept looking at it because I was embarrassed by how much I was saying, how much was coming out of me. And the clock was something neutral to focus on while the words kept coming. When I finished, she said, "You're not behind where you should be. You're exactly where someone in your situation would be." And then she slid a packet across the desk and said, "Let's start at the beginning." There was a lot in that packet: emergency rental assistance applications, which had a backlog of several months but were worth filing immediately. SNAP benefits, which I had been avoiding applying for out of that same brand of pride I had just promised to let go of. A list of job training programs, including one run through the County Workforce Development Office that offered certifications in medical billing and coding. A field with consistent demand that could be completed in 16 weeks. A childcare subsidy program that would cover 80% of after-school care costs while I was in training or employed. A clothing bank for professional wear. A food pantry on Tuesdays and Thursdays 3 blocks from the shelter. A legal aid service that handled tenant rights cases and occasionally fraud recovery, though Brenda was honest with me about the Derek situation. She had seen similar cases, and the recovery rate was low. I read everything in that packet twice, then a 3rd time. Then I started filling out forms, but let me be honest about those first weeks. Because if I skip over them and jump to the part where I started to rebuild, I am not telling you the truth of what this was. Those first weeks were not a montage. They were not a series of triumphant small victories set to hopeful music. They were exhausting and humiliating, and there were days when the weight of the situation pressed down on me with a physical reality that I had not expected. A heaviness in my chest that was there when I woke up and was still there when I fell asleep. The shelter had structure, which helped in some ways and chafed in others. Lights out at 10:30, meals at specific times, a shared bathroom on the family floor with 4 showers that were often occupied in the morning when Lily needed to get ready for school. I had enrolled both kids in the school closest to the shelter, and Lily's commute was 22 minutes by bus, which she handled with a stoicism that both reassured and broke my heart simultaneously. She had always been a serious child, but in those weeks she became quieter, more watchful. She helped Caleb with his backpack every morning without being asked. She did her homework at the shelter's shared computer station in a focused silence that kept the other residents from interrupting her. Something about her posture communicated very clearly that she was working and was not to be disturbed. She ate everything on her plate at meals and never complained about the food, even when the food was genuinely not good. She was 9 years old, and she was carrying herself like someone who had decided that the family needed at least one person who was not visibly struggling, and she had appointed herself to that role without asking for volunteers. One night, about 3 weeks in, I was putting Caleb to bed and I heard Lily on the other side of the room, her voice very quiet, talking to her stuffed rabbit. She was telling it that this was temporary. She was telling it in the specific patient tone she used when she was explaining something to Caleb, that word, temporary, that things that are hard don't stay hard forever. The mom was working on it. I stood in the dark and pressed my hand over my mouth and breathed. I do not have words for what it is to hear your child comforting herself with the reassurances you have given her, playing them back in the dark because she needs them again, because one time was not enough. I do not have words for the particular quality of love and grief that is inseparable in that moment, the swell of it, the ache of it, the way it sits behind your sternum for days afterward. That night I went to the bathroom at the end of the hall, the single one designated for overnight use after lights out, and I sat on the tile floor with my back against the tub and I finally cried. Not the controlled, careful crying I had done in the packing garage after losing my job. The other kind. The kind that has no performance in it, no audience, no management, just the body releasing what it has been holding for too long. It lasted about 8 minutes. Then I washed my face in cold water and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time and said, out loud, to my own reflection, you are going to figure this out. I need you to believe that I believed it, even then. Even in the shelter bathroom at 11 at night with red eyes and no plan beyond filling out the forms on Brenda's list, I believed it in the specific stubborn way that has no basis in logic or evidence but is simply a refusal to accept the alternative. I had 2 children sleeping down the hall, and they needed a mother who believed she was going to figure it out. And so that is what I was going to be. The medical billing and coding program started on a Monday in the 4th week of our shelter stay. Brenda had expedited my application after flagging that I had previous administrative experience that made me a strong candidate. And she had confirmed the childcare subsidy before I enrolled, so I knew Caleb's after-school hours were covered. Lily's school had an extended program until 5:30. The class ran from 9 to 2:30. I could be back at the shelter by 3:15. It sounds like it all fit together. On paper it did. In practice, there were approximately 17 ways it almost didn't work on any given day. The bus that took me to the training center ran every 40 minutes and was chronically 7 to 12 minutes late. If I missed the 9 a.m. window, the next bus arrived at 40 minutes past and I would walk in during the second module, which the instructor, a compact, efficient man named Mr. Okafor, acknowledged with a nod but did not pause for. I missed that first bus twice in the first 2 weeks. Both times because of issues at the shelter that delayed my departure. Once a lock issue with the lockbox that held my documents. Once a morning when Caleb woke with a low-grade fever that turned out to be nothing but that required 40 minutes of monitoring before I could confirm he was well enough for school. On those late days, I sat in the back of the classroom and took notes with a ferocious focus that I think frightened the woman who sat next to me. A younger woman named Kazia, who was fresh out of a nursing assistant program and had enrolled in billing and coding as a backup, She was quiet and precise and had excellent handwriting, and she slid her notes toward me on those late days without comment, without drawing attention to it, just shifted her notebook slightly to the right so I could see. Small kindnesses. I have learned to notice them in ways I did not before. The coursework was harder than I expected. I had good administrative instincts and a solid grasp of organization, but the ICD and CPT coding systems were their own language, dense with specificity and consequence, where a single-digit error could result in a denied claim and a cascade of problems for both patient and provider. I spent evenings in the shelter common room after the kids were in bed, hunched over a laptop with earbuds in, watching tutorial videos and drilling practice exercises with a determination that I think other shelter residents found either inspiring or slightly unhinged depending on their perspective. It was during one of these evening sessions, about 5 weeks into the program, that something happened that I still cannot fully explain without feeling something complicated in my chest. A woman sat down across the table from me. She was maybe 65s, with silver hair pulled back and reading glasses even thicker than Brenda's, and a quality of stillness about her that I would later come to associate specifically with her. Her name was Margaret. She was a volunteer with a faith-based organization that partnered with the shelter to provide tutoring and mentoring services. She had a background in healthcare administration, 31 years of it, and she had retired 2 years prior and was now doing this because, as she put it with a complete absence of self-consciousness, she had more to give and nobody to give it to. She looked at my screen and said, "CPT codes for cardiology or orthopedics." "Cardiology," I said. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down and said, "Walk me through what's confusing you." For the next 2 hours, Margaret dismantled and rebuilt my understanding of cardiac procedure coding in a way that Mr. Okoffa's curriculum had not managed in 5 weeks. She was methodical. She used analogies. She drew small diagrams on a notepad she produced from her bag. She asked questions that made me think rather than just receive, which is a teaching style I'd almost forgotten existed. When the common room lights flickered at 9:30, the signal for quiet hours, she closed her notepad and said, "Same time Thursday?" I said yes before I had finished processing the question. Margaret came back on Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the one after that. For 7 consecutive weeks she sat across from me in the shelter common room and turned herself into the best study partner I have ever had. She brought flashcards she made herself. She brought practice exams from a textbook she owned. She explained the insurance reimbursement systems with a clarity that made the logic of the whole thing visible in a way that coursework could never quite manage. But here is what she did that mattered most, more than the flashcards and the practice exams and the cardiology diagrams. She talked to me like I was a professional, like I was a colleague, a person in the middle of a career transition, not a person in a shelter. She never commented on the shelter. She never expressed pity. She never said anything that carried within it any trace of the assumption that I was less than the woman across from her who had worked 31 years in healthcare administration. I do not think she understood what that did for me. I'm not sure I fully understood it at the time, but it was quietly revolutionary. That particular quality of being seen without the filter of your circumstances, of having someone look at you and see the person you were before the fall and the person you were going to be after it and just skip straight to treating you accordingly. Margaret had a daughter my age in Cincinnati. I never asked about her, and she only mentioned her once, briefly, and in a tone that suggested the relationship was complicated in ways she wasn't prepared to discuss. I didn't push. Some silences are private property, and entering them without invitation is a form of trespass, even if your intentions are good. I passed the first module certification exam on a Friday morning in my 8th week at the shelter. I called Brenda from the bus on the way back, and she said, with genuine warmth, "I knew you would," which was such a Brendo thing to say that I laughed, which surprised me, which started a slightly hysterical loop of laughing at being surprised by the laughing that lasted all the way to my stop and left the other passengers glancing at me with varying degrees of concern. That evening I told Lily and Caleb at dinner. Lily smiled her quiet, serious smile and said, "What does that mean, Mom?" And I explained what certification meant, what billing and coding was, why it mattered. She listened carefully and then she said, "So you're learning to speak doctor language?" "I suppose that's one way to put it," I said. She thought about it. "That's useful," she said. "Like a translator." "Exactly," I said. "Exactly like a translator." Caleb said, "I want to be a translator for dinosaurs." We ate the rest of our meal in the specific warmth that settles around a family when something has gone right. Even something small, even something that is only the beginning of something that still has a long way to go. The mistake happened in week 10. I have thought about this many times. I have analyzed it from every angle. I have been both mercilessly critical and deliberately compassionate toward the version of myself who made it, and I have landed somewhere in the middle, which is that it was understandable and also genuinely costly, and both of those things can be true simultaneously. But Shelter had a 60-day initial placement limit with a possible 30-day extension granted by case management review. I was in week 10, which put me approaching the boundary of that extension. Brenda had already flagged my case for extension approval based on my active enrollment in the training program, and she was confident the extension would be granted. She told me this on a Wednesday. On Thursday, a woman named Patricia, who had been at the shelter longer than anyone on the family floor and who had a particular kind of corridor authority that develops in institutional settings, told me that she had heard the extension approvals were being delayed due to a funding issue, and that 3 families from the previous cohort had been given a week's notice and had scrambled to find alternatives. And that I should not count on Brenda's confidence because Brenda was not the one making the funding decisions. Patricia meant well. I believe this. I believe she was genuinely trying to help me not be blindsided. But the information, whether accurate or partially accurate or filtered through several layers of corridor rumor, landed in me at a moment when I was already stretched thin, already operating on a baseline of anxiety that was only partially held in check by the structure of the program and the momentum of the studying and the anchor of Margaret's Thursday visits. I panicked quietly. I did what I do when I panic quietly. I moved. I acted. I took control of the one variable I thought I could control. There was a listing I had seen on a housing board Brenda maintained, our room for rent in a shared house about 2 miles from the shelter. The landlord was asking for first month and a security deposit, which together came to $850. I did not have $850, but I had one option I had been carefully not touching: a small retirement account I had opened through my old employer, which had about $2,000 in it and which I had been telling myself was for absolute emergencies only. I withdrew the money. I paid the early withdrawal penalty. I paid the taxes withheld. I had just enough left for the deposit and first month after the fees. I signed the lease on a Friday. I told Brenda on Monday. The expression on Brenda's face when I told her is something I have thought about many times. She didn't say, "I told you so," because Brenda was not that kind of person. She said, "The extension was approved on Friday afternoon." She said it quietly, without emphasis. She looked at her desk and then back at me, and there was a careful neutrality in her expression that was doing significant work to contain whatever she actually thought about what I had just done. The extension had been approved. 30 more days. 30 more days of the shelter support and the resource access and the case management and the food and the structure, all of which I had just voluntarily exited in a panic based on corridor rumor, at the cost of my retirement savings and the penalty and the taxes. I said a word I try not to say in front of my children. Then I thanked Brenda for everything. And I went to tell Lily and Caleb that we were moving. The shared house on Clement Street was a 3-bedroom rental where I had the smallest room, about 11 feet by 9 feet, and the 2 kids shared it with me on a double air mattress I bought from a discount store with the last $20 of the withdrawal after fees. The 2 other renters were a quiet man in his 40s named Greg who worked nights and slept most of the day and communicated primarily through a whiteboard in the kitchen, and a younger woman named Sasha who was in graduate school and played ambient music at low volume almost continuously and was unfailingly pleasant and had absolutely no interest in becoming friends with anyone. It was not the shelter. It had a door that locked from the inside and no curfew and no lights out signal, and I could eat something in the kitchen at 2 in the morning without asking permission. These things mattered. After 2.5 months in a shelter, these things mattered anonymously. But the retirement account was gone. The safety net was gone, and I was still 3 weeks from completing the coding certification, still without employment, still in a room with 2 children on an air mattress, now without the support system of the shelter and with rent due in 30 days. I am going to tell you something I have never told anyone except Margaret and Brenda. There was a night in that room on Clement Street, about a week after we moved in, when the air mattress had developed a slow leak that I kept having to re-inflate with a hand pump every few hours, and Caleb had woken up twice with a low-grade cough that wasn't bad enough to warrant real alarm but was bad enough to pull me back from sleep each time. And Lily had a test the next morning, and I could see her lying, awake in the dark, working through her preparation in her head because she did that. She memorized things in the dark. She was extraordinary like that. And I lay on the deflating mattress in the orange light from the street, and I thought, I don't know if I can do this. Not dramatically, not a crisis, just a quiet, honest, deeply tired thought. I don't know if I can do this. And then, immediately, without planning it, without sourcing it from anywhere I could identify, yes, you can. The two thoughts in sequence, one after the other, like a call and a response. I don't know if I can. Yes, you can. I reinflated the mattress. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I made oatmeal on the shared kitchen stove and got both kids to school on time and took the bus to the training center and sat in Mr. Okoffa's class and took notes on a coding system for renal procedures that I did not know I would one day use every single day of my working life. I passed the final certification exam 3 weeks later. I will not overdramatize what happened in that testing room, but I will tell you that I sat in my car in the parking lot after receiving my results, and I looked at the score on the screen for approximately 4 minutes without moving or speaking. 91 out of 100. Passing was 75. I had passed with 91. I called Margaret from the parking lot. She picked up on the second ring. I told her, and she said, in the voice of someone who is unsurprised by good news they nonetheless find genuinely pleasing, "Well, of course you did. Well, of course you did." And then she asked about the next steps, and I told her about the job applications I had already queued up, and she said she had 2 contacts at healthcare administration offices in Columbus who had both mentioned openings, and that she would make some calls. Some people come into your life and change the temperature of it. Margaret was that for me. I have never adequately expressed this to her, and I suspect I never will. Not in a way that matches what I mean by it. But the calls she made in the week after my certification opened to doors that had been completely invisible to me. Doors I had not known existed. And one of them led directly into the room where everything started to change. The interview was at a mid-sized medical billing firm called Lakeview Administrative Services. It was a 12-person office in a business park on the northeast side of Columbus, and the woman who interviewed me was the office director, a no-nonsense person named Diane, who had short silver hair and a handshake like a vice, and who looked at my resume for about 30 seconds before she set it down and said, "Margaret Hobson speaks very highly of you. Tell me about a time you had to manage a complex problem with limited resources." I looked at Diane and I thought about the hand pump for the air mattress. I thought about the spreadsheet at the kitchen table and the $84 inhaler and the 3 weeks of severance and the shelf at the clothing bank where I had found the interview blazer I was currently wearing. I've thought about Lily in the dark telling her stuffed rabbit that this was temporary. I've thought about Brenda's sticky note calendar and Mr. Okafor's nod for the late students and Margaret's flashcards and Caleb's voice saying, "That's an adventure." I said, "I have a pretty extensive recent example," and I told her, not all of it, but enough. Enough of the real thing that the room changed slightly while I was talking. Enough that Diane leaned forward about 2 inches and did not look away for the entire time I was speaking. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "When can you start?" I started on a Monday. $9 more per hour than I had been making at my last job. Full benefits, including dental, a 401k with employer matching, which I mentioned specifically because after watching my retirement savings evaporate in a single decision on a Thursday afternoon, the idea of beginning to build that back had a nearly physical sweetness to it. The first paycheck arrived on a Friday afternoon, direct deposit, and I sat in the break room at Lakeview and looked at the amount on my phone and breathed very carefully through my nose for several seconds. Then I texted Brenda and Margaret the same message. "First paycheck just hit. Thank you." That is all it said. I didn't know how to say the rest of it. Brenda texted back 3 emojis, a small fire, a star, and a person raising both arms. That was all Brenda needed. That was her entire language of celebration, and it was perfect. Margaret called. She said, "Wonderful. Now don't spend it all in one place." And then she asked if Caleb's asthma was well managed, and I said yes, and she said good. And then she said she was proud of me in the voice of someone who doesn't say that lightly, and I thanked her in the voice of someone who has not heard it enough. We moved into our own apartment 4 months after I started at Lakeview. It was not on Westmont Avenue. I had looked, briefly and privately, at whether anything on that street was available in my range. and there was nothing, which was, perhaps, for the best. What we found was a 2-bedroom on Birchwood's 3rd floor, east-facing kitchen window, different building, same morning light. I don't know if I sought that out unconsciously or if it was simply a coincidence, but the first morning I stood at that window and watched the sun come across the floor, I thought of Lily's curtains. I had not bought new curtains yet. The windows were bare. The moving boxers were still stacked in the living room, and the kids were asleep in their new room on actual beds, purchased from a thrift store and assembled by me and Lily over the course of a Saturday afternoon, which had involved one stripped screw and a very specific argument about the instruction manual that I treasure now, because it was the argument of a family in a home, doing the ordinary, frustrating work of building a life. An ordinary frustration had never felt so much like abundance. The next morning, a Saturday, I took the kids to a fabric store. Lily walked through the bolts of cloth with a seriousness that I recognized from the way she walked through bookstores, a kind of reverent deliberation. She touched things. She held fabrics up to the light. She considered. Caleb immediately gravitated toward a bolt of fabric printed with small dinosaurs on a dark green background and declared it non-negotiable. He was 6 by then, and certain about things. Lily chose a fabric that was not yellow. It was a soft blue-gray, the color of morning fog or the sky just after rain, with a very small embroidered pattern along the edge. She held it against the store window to see how the light came through, and she said, "This one." It was not the curtains we had left behind. It was something different, something chosen with more knowledge, something that knew what it was for in a way the yellow curtains hadn't quite. We hung them that afternoon. The afternoon light came through them in a diffuse grab-blue wash that made the living room feel like it was underwater in the best possible way, cool and quiet and full of light without being blinding. I sat on the second-hand couch we had acquired the previous week and looked at those curtains and felt something move through my chest that I have since identified as peace. Specific, earned, quietly triumphant peace. It has been 2 years now since that night on the sidewalk on Westmont Avenue in the rain. I want to tell you what 2 years looks like, not because I want to perform recovery, not because I want to suggest that it was straightforward or complete, or that there are no days when the weight of what happened still makes itself known in the body, but because the distance is real, the change is real. And I have learned that there is something important in naming real things. I work full-time at Lakeview Administrative Services. I have been promoted once, and I am studying for a secondary certification in insurance compliance that would qualify me for a senior billing analyst position that Diane has mentioned to me in terms that are not quite a guaranteed but are also not accidentally mentioned. I have rebuilt my retirement account, not to where it was, not yet, but growing. I have an emergency fund. It is modest. It is real. Lily is 11 now, and she is extraordinary. She started a writing club at her school. She writes stories in a green notebook she carries everywhere. And the stories are specific and strange and full of detail. The kind of writing that comes from a person who has watched the world with great attention and has things to say about what she has seen. She does not talk often about the shelter or the year we lost, but occasionally, unpredictably, she will say something in passing that tells me she is processing it in the way she processes everything, quietly, thoroughly, on her own timeline. She told me recently that she thinks hardship makes people either more fearful or more brave, and that she wants to be the second kind. I didn't know what to say to that. I just told her she already was. Caleb is 7 and he has not changed in any way that I can measure, except that he is taller and has developed an additional passion alongside dinosaurs, which is weather. He checks the forecast every morning. He explains barometric pressure to me with a patient certainty that I try to match with appropriate interest. He still narrates his own life quietly as he moves through it, and when he does it now, in our apartment on Birchwood, with the blue-gray curtains and the morning light, it sounds different than it did, lighter, more exploratory, less like anchoring to certainty and more like genuine curiosity about what comes next. "Mom is making oatmeal," he said last Tuesday. "It is going to be a good day." I checked and there is no rain. Good. We will not need the good umbrella. The good umbrella is distinguished from the backup umbrella by the fact that it actually closes properly. This has become a family categorization system that extends beyond umbrellas. We have the good cutting board and the backup cutting board, the good backpack and the school backpack, the good mugs and the everyday mugs. There is a pleasure in this system that I think is specific to people who have at some point not had a backup of anything, who have known the specific vulnerability of having only one of a thing, and who have rebuilt with the conscious intention of redundancy. I drive to Westmont Avenue sometimes, not often. I don't know exactly why I do it, and I have never made it into a ritual or given it a name. I just find myself occasionally taking that route when I am coming back from errand. Slowing down as I pass the building, looking up at the third floor windows where the yellow curtains used to be. Different curtains now. White, I think, or close to it. Different family. I don't feel what I expected to feel, looking up at those windows. I thought I would feel grief, or loss, or some version of the specific sadness of irreversibility, and there is a little of that. But mostly, what I feel is a strange and quiet gratitude toward the person I was on the sidewalk in the rain. I feel grateful to her for not lying down, for loading the kids in the car, for driving to the shelter, for filling out Brenda's forms and taking the bus to the training center and sitting down across from Margaret and working until 11 p.m. in the common room, for reinflating the air mattress at 2 in the morning and getting up in the same morning and making oatmeal and getting the kids to school and showing up. She didn't know it was going to be okay. She had no evidence at the time that it was going to be okay. She just decided to behave as though it was going to be okay, and then she did the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing after that. I think about her when the days are hard now, because the days are still sometimes hard. Because life does not stop being complicated just because you have cleared one particular catastrophe. I think about her standing in the rain with the garbage bags and the numb fingers in Caleb's hand in hers, and I use her as a kind of internal reference point. If that version of me could keep going, I can keep going. If she could find the next step when there appeared to be no road ahead, I can find the next step. I saw Derek once, about 18 months after this scam, across the parking lot of a grocery store. Unmistakably him, the same particular way he stood with his weight slightly back on his heels. He didn't see me. I stood by my car for a moment and I considered the range of things I could do and say, and then I put my groceries in the trunk and I drove home. I have thought about that choice many times. I have wondered what the version of me who said nothing and drove away says about me, whether it is wisdom or weakness or just the practical arithmetic of a woman who has learned to spend her energy only where it grows something. I don't have a clean answer. I think it might be all three, weighted differently depending on the day. What I know is this. I drove home to an apartment with blue-gray curtains and 2 children doing homework at the kitchen table and oatmeal. I was going to make in the morning and a retirement account I was building back, and a job where someone believed in my competence enough to mention a promotion. And I sat in my car in my parking spot, and I thought about none of that, and I thought about all of it simultaneously. And I felt the weight of the previous 2 years press briefly, fully, honestly, against my chest, and then I exhaled and I went inside. Lily was at the table with her green notebook. She looked up when I came in and said, "I finished the chapter I was stuck on. Tell me about it," I said. She did. She talked for 12 minutes about a character who had been trying to find something she had lost and who had finally realized, in the chapter Lily had finished that afternoon, that what she had been looking for was not the thing she had lost but a different thing entirely. A thing she hadn't known she was missing until the searching had changed her enough to see it. I put the groceries away and listened and said nothing until she was done. Then I said, "I think that's true." She looked at me for a moment, in the specific way she sometimes looks at me when she senses there is more meaning in something than she can quite reach. Then she went back to her notebook. Caleb came in from his room a moment later and announced that tomorrow's forecast was partly cloudy with a low chance of precipitation, which meant there was an 80% chance of outdoor recess, which was important because they were currently losing at Foursquare, but he had a new strategy. I told him I believed in his strategy. He said, "I know, that's why it will work." I stood in the kitchen in the evening light and I listened to my children exist in the rooms around me, their voices and their movements and the specific domestic sounds of a family in a home. And I thought, this is what I was building toward, even when I didn't know I was building, even on the sidewalk in the rain, even in the shelter bathroom at 11 p.m., even on the deflating air mattress at 2 in the morning. This particular evening in this particular apartment with these particular children who are becoming who they are going to be, partly because of what we went through and partly in spite of it and partly in ways that have nothing to do with any of it and are entirely their own. There are still curtains I left behind in a window I will never re-enter. There are curtains I chose new, with more knowledge, in a window that faces the morning light. I think that is, finally, what I have to say about it. Not a lesson, exactly, not an instruction. Just a truth that I have come to live inside of. Sometimes you lose the curtains you chose in innocence. And sometimes, if you can survive the distance between one window and the next, you find yourself standing in a different light. Choosing again, with everything you have learned about what you need, and what holds, and what lasts. The rain is still falling sometimes, but I know how to drive in it now.